The fluorescent lights of courtroom 3B cast harsh shadows across the worn wooden benches as Sarah Mitchell waited for her case to be called. At 60 years old, she carried herself with the quiet dignity that came from decades of navigating spaces where she was often the only black face in the room. Her charcoal gray pantsuit and pearl earrings spoke of understated professionalism, chosen carefully for what should have been a routine court appearance. Case number 2024-TR415, Sarah Mitchell, the court clerk announced, her voice echoing through the half-empty chamber. Sarah gathered her documented evidence, time-stamped photographs, parking meter receipts, and a notarized statement from a nearby shop owner, and approached the podium. Judge Richard Harrison barely glanced up from his bench, his silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses giving him an air of authority that seemed to preclude the need for careful consideration. "Another parking violation," he muttered, shuffling through the papers before him. "How do you plead to parking in a loading zone on March 15th? "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice steady and measured, "I wish to contest this citation. I have evidence that—" "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Harrison interrupted, emphasizing her name with a slight edge that made several heads turn in the gallery. "The sign clearly states no parking between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. The officer's report indicates your vehicle was there at 10:15 a.m. This seems rather straightforward." Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers pressing gently against the manila folder containing her evidence. "If I may, Your Honor, the signage was partially obscured by construction scaffolding that day. I have photographs showing." "Ms. Mitchell," the judge cut in again, his tone carrying the particular patience one might use with a child. "Are you suggesting the officer was incorrect in noting your vehicle's presence in a clearly marked loading zone?" The gallery had grown quieter now, the usual shuffling and whispers falling silent as the exchange continued. Sarah noticed a young law clerk at the side of the courtroom frowning slightly, pen hovering over her notepad. "No, Your Honor. I'm explaining that there were extenuating circumstances. The construction company had just erected the scaffolding that morning, and their permit shows." Judge Harrison's gavel tapped sharply against the sound block. "The presence or absence of scaffolding doesn't change the fact that you parked in a restricted zone. The law must be applied consistently, Ms. Mitchell. Perhaps this will serve as a reminder to pay closer attention to parking signage in the future." Sarah's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around her folder of evidence, years of experience helping her maintain a neutral expression. She noticed how Judge Harrison had handled the 3 previous cases, all involving younger, white defendants, with considerably more patience and attention to their explanations. "The fine will be $500, Harrison announced, already reaching for the next case file. "Pay the clerk on your way out." Sarah stood for a moment longer, her evidence still clutched in her hands, unexamined and unconsidered. The young law clerk was now scribbling furiously in her notebook, glancing between Sarah and the judge with poorly concealed concern. "Thank you, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the same professional tone she'd maintained throughout the exchange. As she turned to leave the podium, she pulled out her phone and made a brief note of the time, date, and the names of the court personnel present. 25 years in public policy had taught her the value of thorough documentation, and something told her these details would matter later. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses with an air of finality, looking down at Sarah Mitchell with the detached expression he'd perfected over his 15 years on the bench. The morning sunlight filtering through the tall courthouse windows seemed to amplify the stark contrast between his elevated position and her solitary stance at the podium. "Ms. Mitchell, while I appreciate your attempt to explain your situation," he began, his tone carrying that particular blend of condescension and authority that seemed reserved for certain defendants, "the law is not a suggestion. It exists to maintain order in our society." Sarah watched as he shuffled some papers on his bench, noting how he hadn't even opened the folder of evidence she'd attempted to present. In the gallery behind her, a few regular court observers, mostly law students and retired citizens who followed local proceedings, exchanged knowing glances. given your apparent reluctance to acknowledge the straightforward nature of your violation. Harrison continued, his voice rising slightly for effect. I feel compelled to impose the maximum fine of $500. Perhaps this will serve as a more effective deterrent than a simple warning. A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the court reporter paused for a fraction of a second, her fingers hovering over her stenotype machine. Maximum fines were rarely imposed for first-time parking violations, and Sarah's spotless record made the decision seem particularly harsh. The young law clerk from earlier, Jessica Torres, was now openly staring at Judge Harrison, her legal pad forgotten in her lap. She'd spent enough time in this courtroom to recognize the disparity. Just 30 minutes earlier, the judge had dismissed a similar citation for a young white businessman who had offered far less compelling evidence. Furthermore, Harrison added, seemingly energized by his own authority, let me be clear about the consequences of future violations. Next time, you might find yourself facing more than just a fine. We have ways of dealing with repeat offenders who don't seem to grasp the importance of civil obedience. Sarah's shoulders remained squared, her expression neutral, though her right hand tightened almost imperceptibly around her handbag. 25 years of navigating rooms filled with men like Harrison had taught her the value of strategic silence. She carefully pulled out her checkbook, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Will that be all, Your Honor? She asked, her voice carrying a calm dignity that made Harrison's pomposity seem all the more excessive. Yes, yes, he waved dismissively, already reaching for the next case file. Pay the clerk on your way out. Next case. As Sarah turned to leave, she noticed Jessica Torres quickly scribbling something in her notebook. The young clerk caught her eye and gave a slight, apologetic shake of her head. Sarah acknowledged her with an almost imperceptible nod. She recognized an ally when she saw one. Making her way to the clerk's window, Sarah pulled out her phone once again, adding to her earlier notes. She documented Harrison's exact words, his demeanor, and the reactions of those present in the courtroom. Years of policy work had taught her that the details that seemed insignificant in the moment often proved crucial later. Ma'am, the clerk called softly as Sarah finished writing her check. Would you like a receipt for your records? Yes, please, Sarah replied, her voice carrying just enough volume to be noted by those nearby. I'll need complete documentation of today's proceedings. All of them. The emphasis in her words wasn't lost on the clerk, who glanced quickly at Judge Harrison's bench before carefully printing out a detailed receipt, complete with case number and timestamps. The granite steps of the state capitol building gleamed in the afternoon sun as Sarah Mitchell made her way through the imposing brass doors. Her morning in traffic court felt worlds away from the polished marble halls and dark wood paneling that surrounded her now. Security guards nodded respectfully as she passed, her credentials hanging familiar and authoritative around her neck. Chairwoman Mitchell called Marcus Reynolds, her chief of staff, hurrying to match her stride. The committee members are already gathering for the quarterly review. Senator Thompson was asking about your morning appointment. Is everything all right? You're usually here hours earlier. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as they walked toward the conference room. Oh, I had quite an educational morning, Marcus. Let's just say the local judiciary provided me with some first-hand experience. They rounded the corner to find the Judicial Review Committee's chamber already filled with the state's most influential legal minds. Federal judges, state prosecutors, and civil rights attorneys all stood in small clusters, their conversations creating a low murmur that quieted as Sarah entered. Sarah, called out Judge Patricia Alvarez, breaking away from a group near the window. We were starting to worry. The docket review for the Eastern District is particularly heavy today. My apologies for the delay, Sarah replied, setting her briefcase down at the head of the massive oak table. I was occupied with an unexpected case study in judicial conduct this morning. She pulled out the crumpled receipt from traffic court, smoothing it carefully on the polished wood surface. Senator Thompson, who had been reviewing documents nearby, glanced up with interest. Oh, something we should be concerned about. Actually, Sarah began, her voice carrying that particular tone that always commanded attention. "I just spent several hours observing Judge Richard Harrison's traffic court, though observing might not be the right word, considering I was the defendant." The room fell silent. Judge Alvarez's eyebrows shot up, and Marcus nearly dropped his tablet. "Harrison, from the 3rd District?" Senator Thompson asked, his face darkening. "The same Harrison whose reappointment review is on today's agenda." Sarah nodded, removing her carefully documented notes from her briefcase. "The very same. And I must say, his conduct was illuminating, particularly his approach to maximum fines and his interesting interpretations of procedural fairness." "Sarah," Marcus interjected, realization dawning on his face, "did he know who you were?" "Oh no," she replied, her voice carrying a hint of steel beneath its professional calm. "Judge Harrison was far too busy lecturing me about civil obedience to bother checking any details about the woman standing before him, though I suspect he'll remember my name soon enough." The implications settled over the room like a heavy cloud. Several committee members exchanged knowing looks. They'd heard whispers about Harrison's courtroom conduct before, but hard evidence had been difficult to secure. "I believe," Sarah continued, addressing the now silent room, "this gives us an unexpected but valuable opportunity to examine our oversight protocols. When our judges don't recognize the chair of their own review committee standing before them, perhaps it's time to question who else they're failing to see properly." She opened her laptop, pulled up a blank document, and looked around the room at her colleagues. "Now, shall we discuss how we're going to address this systemic issue? Because I can assure you, my experience this morning was not an isolated incident." The committee members moved to their seats, their expressions a mix of concern and determination. What had begun as a routine quarterly review was about to become something far more significant. The next 3 weeks saw Sarah Mitchell's office transform into a command center of judicial oversight. Stacks of case files lined the walls, each containing transcripts from Judge Harrison's courtroom over the past 5 years. 2 data analysts sat at a temporary workstation, inputting information into a specialized database, while Marcus Reynolds coordinated with court clerks across the district. Chairwoman, called Jessica Torres, the law clerk from the traffic court, who had now become a key witness and volunteer researcher. "I finished analyzing the fine distributions from the last 30 months. The pattern is, well, you should see this." Sarah moved from her desk to examine the spreadsheet on Jessica's screen. The numbers told a story that made her jaw tighten. Defendants of color receive maximum fines 68% of the time, compared to 12% for white defendants in similar cases. Cross-reference those statistics with income levels and age demographics, Sarah instructed, leaning closer to the screen, and pull the appeal rates for each category. Marcus entered with another box of files, his tie loosened after hours of research. The court reporter's transcripts just arrived from 2022. "And Sarah, you need to see this. 3 other complaints were filed against Harrison last year, all dismissed without investigation." "Of course they were," Sarah murmured, picking up one of the complaint files. "The system was designed to protect itself." "Jessica, who dismissed these complaints?" "Judge Raymond Collins," Jessica replied, pulling up the records. "He served on the Judicial Conduct Committee with Judge Harrison for 8 years. Sarah made a note in her personal ledger. The web of connections was becoming clearer with each passing day. She walked to the window, looking out over the city as she considered their next steps. "What about the body camera footage from the parking enforcement officers?" she asked, turning back to her team. "Any patterns in how violations are reported?" A young analyst named David looked up from his computer. "Yes, ma'am. We've reviewed 6 months of footage. Officers spend an average of 43% more time monitoring vehicles in predominantly minority neighborhoods, despite equal parking violation rates across all districts." Sarah nodded, unsurprised but still disappointed. "Document everything. I want this data irrefutable." The investigation had grown beyond just Judge Harrison. Each layer they peeled back revealed new connections, More disparities, deeper problems. Sarah had known this would happen. It's why she'd been so careful to document every detail of her own experience. Ms. Mitchell, Jessica spoke up, her voice hesitant. I've been reviewing the court records from Judge Harrison's first year on the bench. There's a noticeable shift in his sentencing patterns around 2015. Before that, his rulings show much more consistency across demographic groups. Sarah moved to examine these earlier records. Something changed. Marcus, can you pull the Judicial Conduct Committee membership records from 2015? The team worked late into the evening, piecing together a comprehensive picture of systemic bias that had evolved over years. Sarah's personal experience had opened the door, but what they were uncovering went far beyond one judge's prejudiced behavior in traffic court. Tomorrow, Sarah announced as they prepared to wrap up for the night, I want to begin preparing the presentation for the full committee. We'll need visuals, charts, graphs, timeline analysis. Everything needs to be clear enough that no one can dismiss these findings as isolated incidents. She picked up the original receipt from her traffic court fine, now sealed in a clear evidence bag. What had started as a simple parking ticket had become a catalyst for exposing years of institutional bias. As she gathered her things to leave, Sarah thought about Judge Harrison, still unaware that his routine morning in traffic court had set this entire investigation in motion. Jessica, she called as she reached the door, make sure we have the courtroom security footage from that morning. Sometimes, seeing is believing. The state capitol's main conference room hummed with nervous energy as committee members filed in for the emergency session. Bronze nameplates gleamed under crystal chandeliers, each seat occupied by someone who held significant sway over the state's judicial system. Sarah Mitchell stood at the head of the long mahogany table, her presentation materials arranged with deliberate precision. Before we begin, Sarah announced, her voice carrying the weight of 3 weeks' intensive investigation, I want to thank everyone for accommodating this urgent meeting. What we're about to discuss requires immediate attention. Judge Patricia Alvarez, who had been briefed earlier, sat to Sarah's right, her expression grave. Senator Thompson settled into his chair on the left, adjusting his reading glasses as the first slide appeared on the wall-mounted screens. Over the past 3 weeks, Sarah continued, our office has conducted a comprehensive review of judicial conduct in the 3rd District, with particular focus on demographic disparities in sentencing and fine assignments. The room grew still as data began flowing across the screens. Charts and graphs painted a stark picture of systematic bias, each statistic more damning than the last. Sarah noticed several committee members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. As you can see, she gestured to a particularly telling graph. Defendants of color are 5 times more likely to receive maximum fines for first-time offenses. The elderly and those from lower-income neighborhoods face similar disparities. These numbers are troubling. Judge Michael Roberts interrupted, leaning forward. But surely there must be other factors at play. Perhaps differences in repeat offenses, or... I anticipated that question. Sarah replied smoothly, nodding to Marcus, who brought up the next set of data. We've controlled for prior offenses, income levels, and representation status. The pattern remains consistent. Jessica Torres, now officially seconded to the committee, distributed thick folders containing detailed analysis of individual cases. The young clerk's hands trembled slightly as she placed the last folder in front of Judge Collins, who had dismissed the previous complaints. What's most concerning, Sarah continued, is the systematic suppression of complaints regarding these disparities. Our investigation reveals that 17 formal complaints were filed in the past year alone. All were dismissed without proper review. Judge Collins' face reddened as several heads turned in his direction. Sarah maintained her professional demeanor, though she noted his discomfort with quiet satisfaction. The question before us today isn't just about statistics, she said, her voice taking on a more personal tone. It's about the fundamental fairness of our judicial system. When bias becomes institutional, it threatens the very foundation of justice. Senator Thompson cleared his throat. What are your recommendations, Chairwoman Mitchell? Sarah pressed a button. bringing up her final slide. First, immediate suspension of all maximum fine authorities pending review. Second, mandatory bias training for all district judges with quarterly assessments. Third, she paused, letting the tension build. A complete audit of Judge Richard Harrison's court, effective immediately. A murmur ran through the room. Judge Harrison's name carried weight, and several committee members had long-standing relationships with him. Is Harrison aware he's under investigation? Judge Alvarez asked, though her slight smile suggested she already knew the answer. Not yet, Sarah replied, allowing herself a small smile. He's been summoned to appear before this committee tomorrow morning at 9. I believe it's time we had a direct conversation about his approach to judicial discretion. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Tomorrow's meeting would be more than a simple review. It would be a reckoning. If there are no objections, Sarah concluded, looking around the room with quiet authority, I move that we proceed with these recommendations immediately. The integrity of our justice system cannot wait. One by one, hands raised in agreement. The vote was unanimous. At precisely 8:55 a.m., Judge Richard Harrison strode into the state capitol building, his judicial robes traded for an expensive charcoal suit that spoke of both authority and affluence. His confident footsteps echoed through the marble hallway as he approached the committee chamber, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. After 15 years on the bench, these routine reviews had become little more than formalities. Judge Harrison, Marcus Reynolds greeted him at the door, his tone professionally neutral. The committee is ready for you. Harrison nodded dismissively, barely glancing at Marcus as he entered the chamber. The room's gravity hit him immediately. Every seat at the massive table was filled, with additional chairs brought in for what appeared to be a full complement of state judicial officials. Quite a turnout for a routine review, he remarked, his voice carrying a hint of amusement that would soon vanish. Judge Harrison called a familiar voice from the head of the table. Please, take a seat. The color drained from Harrison's face as he recognized Sarah Mitchell, now rising from her chair at the committee head. She wore the same pearl earrings from traffic court, though her simple pantsuit had been replaced by an impeccably tailored blazer bearing the state seal. Ms. Mitchell, he stammered, his composed facade cracking. Chairwoman Mitchell, Senator Thompson corrected firmly. Chair of the State Judicial Review Committee. Harrison sank into the indicated chair, his hands gripping the armrests as realization dawned. To his left, he noticed Jessica Torres, his former clerk, now sitting among the official record keepers. Judge Harrison, Sarah began, her voice carrying the same measured tone she'd used in his courtroom. We're here to discuss some concerning patterns in your judicial conduct, particularly regarding the disparity in how you handle cases involving minorities and elderly defendants. She pressed a button, and the screens around the room lit up with damning statistics, including footage from his courtroom, including his interaction with Sarah 3 weeks earlier. I can explain, Harrison began, but Sarah held up a hand, just as he had done to her. The evidence speaks quite clearly, Judge Harrison, she continued, sliding a thick folder across the table. 5 years of documented bias in sentencing, 17 dismissed complaints, and a particularly interesting morning 3 weeks ago, where you saw fit to impose a maximum fine without reviewing presented evidence. Harrison's face flushed as he recognized his own words from the traffic court footage playing silently on the screens. Perhaps this will serve as a reminder to pay closer attention. Chairwoman Mitchell, he attempted again, his voice notably less confident, had I known who you were. That's precisely the problem, isn't it? Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp but controlled. Justice shouldn't depend on recognizing someone's position of authority. It shouldn't depend on their race, age, or social status. Yet in your courtroom, it consistently has. The room fell silent as Sarah rose from her chair, commanding the space just as Harrison had done from his bench weeks earlier. You have 2 options before you, Judge Harrison, she stated, placing another document on the table. Option 1. Immediate suspension, followed by mandatory sensitivity training, implicit bias education, and 6 months of supervised probationary return to the bench. Harrison swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. And option 2. Immediate resignation, effective today, with a public statement acknowledging the findings of this investigation. The judge looked around the room, searching for sympathetic faces among his longtime colleagues. He found none. The committee will give you 1 hour to decide, Sarah concluded, gathering her papers. I suggest you use this time to reflect on how it feels to sit on the other side of unchecked authority. As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. Oh, and Judge Harrison, do pay attention to the signs. They're quite clearly marked. The state courthouse buzzed with activity as judges from all districts filed into the main assembly hall for the first mandatory bias training session. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, illuminating faces both reluctant and resigned. At the front of the room, Sarah Mitchell stood with a team of civil rights attorneys, law professors, and social justice advocates she personally selected for this initiative. The changes we implement today, Sarah began, her voice carrying across the packed hall, aren't punitive. They're restorative. They're about building a justice system that truly serves all citizens equally. In the third row, Judge Harrison sat quietly, his presence a visible reminder of why they were all there. He'd chosen option 1, suspension and rehabilitation, though not without considerable internal struggle. His normally pristine suit looked slightly rumpled, his demeanor subdued after weeks of mandatory sensitivity workshops. Dr. Angela Rivera, a leading expert in implicit bias, stepped forward to begin the session. Let's start with a simple exercise. Consider the last time you made an assumption about someone before they spoke a single word in your courtroom. Uncomfortable shifting filled the room. Sarah noticed several judges avoiding eye contact, while others began taking notes with unusual intensity. Accountability, Dr. Rivera continued, begins with acknowledgement. Judge Harrison, would you share your insights from the past month of training? The room fell silent. Harrison slowly stood, his face carrying the weight of recent revelations. He paused, clearing his throat. I never saw myself as biased. I thought I was being firm, maintaining order. But when forced to watch recordings of my own court sessions, to see the patterns in my behavior, he looked directly at Sarah. I realized I wasn't serving justice. I was serving my own prejudices. Sarah nodded encouragingly, remembering the heated discussions during his review hearings. The statistics had been undeniable. 71% of maximum fines issued to minorities, 65% of interrupted testimonies involving elderly or minority defendants, 84% of dismissed evidence from lower-income plaintiffs. The new oversight protocols are non-negotiable, Sarah announced, gesturing to the packets being distributed. Monthly review of fine distributions, mandatory body camera footage retention, and quarterly demographic analysis of case outcomes. Every judge will receive detailed reports of their sentencing patterns. Jessica Torres, now promoted to full-time oversight coordinator, began demonstrating the new digital monitoring system. The software flags potential bias indicators in real time, she explained. It's not about punishment, it's about awareness. As the presentation continued, Sarah observed the shifting attitudes in the room. Some judges took notes furiously, others engaged in serious discussions during breakout sessions. The resistant faces from the morning began showing signs of understanding. Implementation begins immediately, Sarah concluded, standing at the podium. Each of you will be assigned a peer review partner. Monthly reports are mandatory. And yes, she added, allowing a small smile, this applies to traffic court too. After the session, Judge Harrison approached her, his manner markedly different from their first encounter. Chairwoman Mitchell, he began, I've been thinking about that day in traffic court, about how many others like you I never really saw. It's not about me, Judge Harrison, Sarah replied firmly. It's about every person who stands before you seeking justice. They all deserve the same consideration, the same respect, regardless of who they might be outside your courtroom. He nodded slowly. The training. It's opening my eyes to things I never wanted to see before. Things I need to see. That's the beginning of change, Sarah responded, gathering her materials. Now the real work starts. Making sure that change lasts. As the judges filed out, Sarah watched Harrison join a discussion group with younger judges, sharing his insights from the sensitivity training. Sometimes, she reflected, true accountability wasn't about punishment, it was about transformation. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell stood in the back of courtroom 3B, now virtually unrecognizable from the day of her traffic citation. Gone was the intimidating silence. In its place, a steady hum of respectful proceedings. The old fluorescent lights had been replaced with softer, more natural lighting, a small but symbolic change reflecting the broader transformation within. A young black woman stood at the podium, explaining a parking violation dispute. Judge Harrison, back on the bench after completing his rehabilitation program, listened attentively, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed her submitted evidence. "Thank you for providing such detailed documentation," he said, his tone carrying none of the dismissive edge that had once characterized his court. "I see the construction company confirms they failed to post proper signage during their work. Case dismissed." Sarah made a note on her tablet, adding another data point to her ongoing monitoring report. The changes were more than cosmetic. They were fundamental. The numbers told the story. Fine distributions now showed no significant demographic disparities. Hearing times averaged the same length regardless of the defendant's background, and appeal rates had dropped by 60%. Jessica Torres, now supervising the district's judicial monitoring program, approached quietly. "The quarterly reports are ready, Chairwoman," she whispered, handing over a tablet. Judge Harrison's metrics show consistent improvement. His case handling patterns show no statistical bias for the past 3 months. Sarah nodded, scrolling through the data. The monitoring system they'd implemented was doing its job, but more importantly, the judges were doing theirs, with newfound awareness and accountability. During a brief recess, Harrison stepped down from the bench, approaching Sarah with the confidence of someone who had done the hard work of change. "Chairwoman Mitchell," he greeted her, his smile genuine. "I wondered if you'd be observing today." "Regular oversight is part of our new normal, Judge Harrison," she replied, returning his smile. "Though I must say, there's been less need for intervention lately." He gestured to the renovated courtroom. "You know, when you first implemented these changes, I thought they were excessive. The training, the monitoring, the monthly reviews, but now I see something I missed before." "And what's that?" "Justice isn't just about following the law," he said, glancing at his bench. "It's about seeing people, really seeing them. Every story deserves to be heard." A young law student intern passed by, carrying a stack of files labeled with a new color-coded system designed to prevent demographic tracking until after decisions were made. The changes were everywhere, woven into the fabric of daily court operations. "The other judges are talking about implementing similar changes in their districts," Sarah mentioned, showing him the latest data. "Your courtroom is becoming a model for reform." Harrison straightened his robes, preparing to return to the bench. "You know, that day you stood before me, it could have ended differently. I could have fought the changes, taken early retirement, tried to protect the old way of doing things. But you didn't," Sarah acknowledged. "You chose to learn, to grow, to change." As the bailiff called the court back into session, Sarah watched Harrison return to his position, now a different kind of authority figure, one who understood that true justice required both wisdom and humility. Making her way out of the courtroom, Sarah passed a wall where a new sign hung prominently, "Equal justice under law," words that, finally, were becoming more than just a motto. Her parking ticket, framed in her office alongside the implementation orders for the new oversight system, had become more than just a personal vindication. It had become a catalyst for lasting change, proving that sometimes the greatest transformations begin with the smallest moments of injustice recognized and corrected.